You're listening to Procurement 6, the weekly podcast from the team at Art of Procurement that summarizes this week in procurement in just 6 short segments.
I'm Kelly Barner, and today is Friday, October 14th, 2022.
6.
In this week's Tip of the Week, I'd like to remind everyone to look beyond the headlines when reading the news. Case in point, the recently averted railway workers' strike. Estimates had placed an actual strike as leading to $2 billion in daily economic impact. So everyone was thrilled and relieved on September 15th when Labor Secretary Marty Walsh announced a deal that would keep the trains running on time. Hold on though, not so fast. The agreement was tentative and only included representatives from the major railways and union leadership. Union members still have to vote to ratify or reject the proposal, and there are 115,000 of them nationwide. The news broke this week that members from the third biggest rail union have voted to reject the agreement. This story is far from over, and it is seriously going to impact our supply chains if it doesn't have a happy ending. So my tip is, read beyond the headlines and don't consider your supply chain risks prevented until they are truly behind you.
5.
In this week's Art of Procurement podcast, Philip Eidson is joined by Chris McCarney, Principal Procurement and Outsourcing Advisory, and Marcos Cortes, Managing Director, HCLS Strategy, both from KPMG LLP. They joined us for a recent AOP Live session focused on better understanding procurement's role in mergers, acquisitions, and divestments. Phil had asked Chris a question about whether the need for secrecy was a legitimate reason for keeping procurement from participating in pre-deal talks. Here's what Chris had to say.
Every deal is a snowflake, as we say, right? There are unique aspects to every deal. And are there things that need to be held confidential? Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. There's typically going to be a degree of secrecy. But again, that doesn't mean procurement needs to be completely uninformed. What it does mean is, even if I am not in the circle, right? How do I arm again those deal teams with the information before they're even considering the deal, right? And so secrecy should not be an excuse, right? And so there's a theme I keep coming back to is as much preparation as you can do and education you could do between your deal teams and your procurement teams in advance. The secrecy is not going to be an issue, right? Because the deal team's asking the right questions on your behalf.
It's almost feels like if you're being asked to get involved, when you're already down the process of the deal cycle, it's already too late. It's that proactiveness in advance, and the organization recognizing that there's a value that procurement can bring to the table and there's data that procurement has. If you haven't done all that, the upfront work that's not necessarily related to a merger or an acquisition, that perception leads to how involved you get and perhaps where the excuses and the objections come from as the process gets more serious.
In other words, mergers, divestments, and acquisitions are yet another place where procurement is either in, based on existing relationships, or out, based on reputation. There is a lot more to learn from this conversation, so catch it wherever you listen to podcasts or listen at artofprocurement.com/podcast.
4.
In the weeks leading up to Mastermind Live 2022, Art of Procurement partnered with our platinum sponsor Globality to run a series of LinkedIn polls. We wanted to capture a snapshot of how procurement believes they are viewed by the business, and then connect that perception to the quality of the experience procurement provides through processes and digital platforms. We learned some very interesting things and received a number of comments that were worthy of deeper thought. To capture all of that and add some additional commentary of our own, We have now published a short white paper titled Increasing Procurement's Impact During Turbulent Times. Here are the 3 poll questions. 1. How do stakeholders perceive procurement? 2. Could a consumer-like buying process increase the likelihood of stakeholder compliance? And 3. Is digitally enabled self-service the answer to improved collaboration with the business? As a teaser, I'll tell you that 43% of respondents told us that the business sees them as a necessary evil. But what exactly does that mean? To find out, read the full report by going to artofprocurement.com/resources and look for white papers. Or you can just click the link in today's episode notes.
This is Procurement 6 from Art of Procurement. To get notified every time an episode is published, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. 3.
In other news, I recently had the opportunity to offer some comments for a Forbes article on supplier diversity written by Art of Procurement friend Kate Vitasic. She wrote about the investment Boeing Australia is making to partner with Indigenous businesses and why relational contracting is playing a key role in both Boeing and those suppliers getting full value from the partnership. What stood out to me here was the all too common challenge of small, diverse-owned businesses trying to build more than transactional relationships with their much larger corporate clients. Boeing solved this by making longer-term commitments to those suppliers. That gives them the financial stability to really lean in and create value. It also gives the Boeing team time to learn about the supplier's capabilities in return. Let's face it, good intentions are not enough to ward off growing pains on either side of a deal. But time and trust and relationships, those are priceless, as are the benefits to the buyer and the supplier. To read the full article, including my exact comments, check out the link on today's show notes page.
2.
In this week's Dial P for Procurement podcast, I covered the kind of story that procurement doesn't often see. First of all, it was a story about procurement. Second of all, it featured a very high-profile CPO who was taken down by a 30-second TikTok video that went viral. Tony Blevins was, until recently, the vice president of procurement at Apple. He was asked by a car aficionado what he did for a living and gave a naughty answer. He didn't tie himself to Apple in any way, but the damage was done. He apologized, but employees complained. And then, just like that, he was out. Now, I suspect he was out for a much bigger reason, and that was his particular way of running his procurement organization. Tony Blevins was an old-school, savings-only, hard-nosed negotiator that would stop at nothing to avoid paying full price. Personally, I think Apple was done with his approach, and they were also done with the bridges that approach was burning between them and their very important supplier community. Again, that's just me. Listen to the episode, and then you can decide for yourself. You'll find the episode linked in the show notes or in the Dial P for Procurement podcast stream available on all major podcast listening platforms.
1.
Last but not least, we have a brand new AOP Live on the calendar. On October 27th at 11 a.m. Eastern, Philip Eidson will be joined by 3 members of the WNS Denali team to talk about how to supercharge your digital strategy. As always, there are no slides, just your questions, live discussions, and real, honest answers. Go to artofprocurement.com/calendar and sign up today, and be sure to submit a question or two while you are there. Phil may just be presenting your question to the speakers on October 27th.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next Friday at 6 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. If you've enjoyed this pod, help us grow and tell your peers to search for Procurement 6 wherever they get their podcasts.